David jolted awake, his body rigid, a sharp pain racing through his chest as if the air itself was a weight too heavy to bear. The cold was suffocating, pressing in on him from all sides. His head spun and his throat was raw as if he had been screaming for hours. For a moment he couldn't even remember how he had gotten here. The last thing he remembered was walking through the snow, the blinding cold sinking into his bones. He tried to push himself up, but the sudden motion only made his vision blur even more. It wasn't just the cold that made him feel like this, it was something deeper. His mind struggled to make sense of his surroundings, of the sharp scent of metal and something else, something warm and unfamiliar, something alive. His eyes adjusted to the dim lighting, and he saw that he was lying on a cot, swathed in an unfamiliar thermal suit, his body still shivering uncontrollably. He turned his head slowly, his gaze landing on a woman sitting near him. She was unlike anyone David had ever seen, alien of course, but more than that. Green-skinned with sharp, angular features, her eyes glowed faintly, almost as if they were reflecting the soft light in the room. She watched him, not with the cold detachment he had expected from an alien, but with something akin to curiosity. "You're stable," she said, her voice low and calm, as though she were accustomed to handling situations like his. David's mind scrambled for an answer. Where am I?" "Somewhere safe," she replied, standing up fluidly, her movements graceful. Her voice was firm, yet there was an undertone of something else, something warmer, more human in the way she spoke. She crossed the room and pressed 2 fingers to his neck. "You were hypothermic, bleeding, very nearly dead." David stared at her, struggling to make sense of it all. His throat burned with thirst, but his mouth was too dry to speak properly. His hand reached up instinctively to touch his neck, but he was too weak. "Who are you?" he managed, his voice barely a rasp. "I'm Sial," she said simply. "This is a geothermal survival pod beneath the glazing wastelands of Zios." David's heart skipped a beat. Zios, he'd heard of it only in passing as a distant, frozen world caught in the grip of a never-ending civil war. A place no diplomat, no human had any business visiting. A dangerous, hostile planet. But what had he been doing here? He hadn't planned to come to Zios. He hadn't signed up for any mission this dangerous. His body screamed with fatigue and pain, and his mind could barely latch onto the gravity of the situation. "You were almost dead when we found you," Sial continued, her voice cutting through his confusion. "Mintina," she gestured to the bed beside him, "kept you warm, not because she likes you, but because it was efficient." David looked over, his gaze shifting to the other figure lying still on the cot next to him. A second woman, green-skinned like Sial, her features softer, more serene. She was sleeping, her chest rising and falling with slow, steady breaths. "That's Mintina," Sial added, "my sister." David stared at Mintina, then back at Sial. He blinked, trying to pull together the shattered pieces of his memory. "What happened? How did I get here?" Sial sighed, looking almost amused at his confusion. "You were freezing to death in the snow. We rescued you, saved your life. Now you owe us." David frowned, not understanding. "Owe you?" "Under the code of Zios," Sial said, her gaze unwavering. "When one life is saved through the sacrifice of resources, shelter, or danger to another, a blood debt is incurred. You are now Aaron, lifebound to Clan Vector." David's mind raced as he tried to process the alien concept. A blood debt, a life bound to a clan. This wasn't Federation diplomacy. This wasn't something he had been prepared for. "You're saying I owe you?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Not just to us," Sial replied, folding her arms across her chest. "To the throne of Zios. By saving you, we've made you our Aaron, our bond to the throne itself. You are now ours." David's head spun. "I'm what?" His pulse quickened, the weight of her words settling like a stone in his stomach. This is insane." Sial's expression remained unchanged, calm and collected as if this was just another day for her. "The throne has been taken. The royal bloodline is scattered, presumed dead. Our mother, the matron queen, is missing, and without her the core our planet's lifeblood begins to break down. We need to take it back, and for that we need you." David turned his head, eyes falling back on Mintina. She was still sleeping peacefully, unaware of their conversation. He could barely believe what he was hearing. The throne of Zios, a planet on the brink of destruction, and somehow in the middle of it all he was the key. "You're human," Sial continued. "But not just any human, you've been marked. Your survival here has already created a bond. You have a role to play, David, whether you like it or not." David's heart hammered in his chest. He wasn't prepared for this. None of this made sense. "I'm not here to fight," he said, though he could already feel the weight of the situation pressing in. "I'm a diplomat, I'm not a soldier." Sial's lips curled into a faint smile. "No, you're not a soldier, but you move like one. I can see it in you. There's something about you, something that makes you more than just a tool." David's breath hitched as a chilling realization set in. His life was no longer his own. He had been pulled into something much larger, much more dangerous than any political negotiation he had ever been a part of. "And what happens when I don't want to help?" he asked, though he feared he already knew the answer. Sial didn't hesitate. "You don't have a choice. You're bound by blood now to us, to Zios." David stared at her for a long moment, the gravity of her words sinking in. He had survived the cold, but now he was stuck in a war he had no part in. Bound to a planet, a people, and a cause that meant nothing to him. And yet the more he heard, the more he realized that this wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about something much bigger than he could ever have imagined. Suddenly Mintina stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She looked between David and Sial, her gaze sharp, calculating. She smiled just slightly before her voice rang out, cutting through the tension in the room. "He's awake," she said softly. "He understands the debt." Sial looked at David, her eyes unreadable. "Well, David," she said, "it seems you owe us. Welcome to the fight for Zios." David could only stare at her, his mind reeling. His life was no longer his own. He had been dragged into a war, and whether he liked it or not, there was no turning back. David barely had time to process the weight of Sial's words before Mintina sat up. Her gaze was still foggy with sleep, but there was something in the way she looked at him that made him feel as though she was appraising every part of him, sizing him up like a valuable piece of property. "So," Mintina said with a slow grin, "you've met my sister. She's a bit much, isn't she?" David could only manage a tired nod, still reeling from what had just transpired. His mind kept replaying the words Sial had spoken. Lifebound, blood debt, Aaron. He had no idea what any of it meant, but he was starting to suspect it wasn't going to be good for him. Mintina swung her legs off the cot, standing up with the fluid grace of someone who had spent years moving through hostile environments. She was dressed in what looked like combat armor, a sleek, form-fitting suit of matte black with faintly glowing blue runes etched along the arms and chest. "We need to move," Mintina said, her voice low and serious now. "Corbin's forces are closing in on the capital. We've got one shot at this. No more delays." David struggled to sit up, the strength in his body still just a shadow of what it should have been. "I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do. I'm not a fighter," he rasped, his throat still raw from the cold. Mintina gave him a knowing look, her eyes narrowing. "You're a diplomat. That means you're good with words and you understand the value of negotiation. But we don't have time for diplomacy anymore. Zios is dying, David. You don't have the luxury of standing on the sidelines." Sial, who had been standing at the far side of the room, watching the exchange silently, stepped forward. "It's not just about diplomacy," she said, her voice level. "It's about survival. We're going to need every resource we have, every ally we can find, and that's where you come in." David pushed himself to his feet, shaky but determined. His eyes met Sial's. "What exactly do you need me to do?" Mintina's grin returned, though it was far more dangerous now. "You're going to lead us into battle." David blinked, incredulous. "Lead? I don't know the first thing about leading a rebellion." Mintina and Sial exchanged a look, one that David couldn't quite interpret, before Sial spoke again, her voice soft but heavy with meaning. "You've already led us, David. Your survival here has connected you to this world, to us. You're a part of this now. And whether you want to or not, you have a role to play, a big one." David ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. "This is insane. I'm just one person. I can't." "You're more than just one person," Mintina interrupted, stepping closer. Her eyes were intense, like she was daring him to argue. "I've seen you fight. Your instincts are solid. You survived on Zios without proper gear. You killed a scout. You did that on your own without training. You don't just survive, you adapt." David swallowed hard, his throat feeling like sandpaper. He looked down at the thermal suit Mintina had dressed him in. It wasn't his, but it felt right somehow, as though it had been tailored to fit him, as though it were a reminder of the new reality he was trapped in. "What about Corbin?" he asked, his voice steadying slightly as he found his footing. "What do we do about him?" Sial's expression darkened. Corbin's not just some warlord, she said, her tone cold. He's the one who's tearing this planet apart. He used mercenaries and defectors to storm the Citadel 6 months ago. Now the throne is in his hands and he's doing whatever it takes to keep it. And the core, the heart of Zyos, is slowly falling apart because of him. He doesn't care about the planet, he just wants control. And you think I can help take him down? David asked, his skepticism starting to give way to curiosity. Mintina smirked again, though this time there was something almost reassuring in it. Not just help. You're going to help us retake the throne. You're going to be our consort, our symbol of unity. And more importantly, you're going to help us bring Zyos back from the brink. David felt the ground shift under him. A consort? A symbol? He wanted to laugh, but there was no humor in it. None at all. He had walked into this mess as a simple diplomat, and now he was being asked to become a piece of their puzzle, a pawn in their war. I don't even know the first thing about ruling a planet, he muttered, feeling his stomach twist. How am I supposed to fix this? Mintina's eyes softened slightly, though the determination in them remained unchanged. You don't have to know everything. You just have to want to help to make it right. Before he could respond, the sound of distant explosions rumbled through the walls of the pod, shaking the ground beneath them. The tremor passed quickly, but the urgency was unmistakable. We don't have much time, Sial said, already moving toward the door. Corbin's forces are closing in faster than we thought. If we don't act now, everything's lost. David didn't hesitate this time. He followed them through the narrow corridors of the survival pod, each step carrying him farther away from the man he had been and closer to the dangerous, unfamiliar world he was being thrust into. They emerged into the cold, open air of Zyos, the planet's icy wastes stretching out before them. The terrain was brutal, an endless expanse of white, with jagged mountains in the distance and the faint outline of war machines in the horizon. The winds were howling, sharp and unforgiving, as if the planet itself was trying to push them away. David felt a deep chill in his bones, but it was nothing compared to the chill he felt inside. This was a different kind of cold, a cold that went deeper than the weather. You ready? Mintina asked, turning to him, her voice cutting through the wind. David nodded, trying to ignore the fear creeping into his chest. I don't think I have a choice. She gave him a wry smile. That's the spirit. But as they set off, David couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking toward something much darker than just a battle. This war wasn't just about survival, it was about Zyos itself. And as much as he wanted to walk away, he knew there was no turning back. Not now. The first shots were fired just hours later, and David realized that war was never as simple as the stories he had read. It was ugly, brutal, and the stakes were higher than he could have ever imagined. But there was something else, too. The closer he got to Mintina and Sial, the more he realized that he wasn't just fighting for a throne, he was fighting for them, for their world, and for himself. The question wasn't whether he could survive. The question was whether he could live with what it would cost him. As David and the sisters approached their next target, a figure emerged from the distance, someone he never expected to see again. A Federation soldier, someone from his past, walking straight toward them with a mission in hand. David's heart sank as the figure came closer, the recognition dawning on him. It was someone he thought had been dead. And now everything was about to change. The wind howled as the small group made their way through the icy expanse of Zyos. David's heart still pounded from the sudden confrontation with the Federation soldier, someone he thought had been dead, someone he'd once fought beside. He hadn't been ready for the sight of her, and he wasn't sure if he could ever be. Stay close, Sial said, breaking his train of thought. She was leading them through the frozen wilderness, her movements precise, deliberate. This area is too exposed. Mintina, walking slightly ahead, shot David a glance, her green eyes scanning the horizon. Focus, David, she said, her voice sharp but not unkind. You need to be ready for what's coming. David nodded, the weight of her words pressing down on him. He was far past the point of being ready. After all, he had no choice. He had crossed a line the moment he had survived the blizzard, dragged into a world of war and politics that he didn't understand. And now the next step was something even more overwhelming, a ritual. It wasn't long before they reached the site, an ancient temple carved into the side of a towering mountain, hidden from view. The entrance was guarded by statues of long-forgotten gods, figures with sharp, angular features that seemed to stare at him with judgmental eyes. The temple itself was carved from stone, with intricate designs running along the walls, depicting the royal family of Zios in various forms of reverence. Sial didn't hesitate as she approached the entrance, her fingers brushing the cool surface of the door. A faint hum filled the air, and the massive stone door slowly slid open with a low groan, revealing the dimly lit interior. It was colder inside, the walls lined with glowing runes that pulsed gently, casting an eerie light. "This is where the binding happens," Sial said quietly, her tone far more serious than usual. "The bond will tie you to us, to Clan Vector. This isn't just a blood debt anymore. You're becoming a part of our family, David." David hesitated on the threshold. The room smelled ancient, filled with the scent of earth and incense, as though it had been waiting for this moment for centuries. The chamber was circular, the floor made of smooth stone, with 3 pedestals placed in a triangle. At the center of each pedestal was a deep groove where Zios' bloodline symbols had been carved. "You don't have to do this," Mintina said softly, her voice uncharacteristically gentle. She stood beside him now, her gaze meeting his, steady and unflinching. "You're free to walk away, David. No one will stop you." David looked at her, feeling the gravity of her words sink deep into his bones. She was offering him an out, an escape from all of this madness, from the chains that had already begun to form around him. But then he thought of the people on Zios, the ones who were fighting for a future, for a life that could be something more than endless war and bloodshed. And he thought of her, of Mintina, of Sial. He couldn't walk away. Not now. Not after everything that had happened. "I don't know what's coming," he said, his voice firm, "but I'm not running." Mintina's eyes softened, a rare emotion flickering there before she quickly masked it with a more familiar, determined look. "Good. You're stronger than I thought." Sial, who had been standing silently nearby, stepped forward, her eyes now fixed on David. "This isn't just about blood," she said, her voice quiet but full of weight. "It's about power, the power of this world, the power of the core." She gestured to the stone chamber around them, the runes pulsing ever so faintly. "You will be bound to it, David, to us, to Zios." David's heart skipped. He had felt something in the air ever since they arrived, a strange energy that he couldn't explain. It was as if the very planet was alive and it was watching him, waiting for him to make his move. He felt the pull of the core deep within him, a connection that ran deeper than just survival. It was primal, ancient. He didn't understand it, but it was there, wrapped around him like a second skin. Sial motioned for him to step forward. "Kneel." David obeyed, his knees hitting the cold stone with a muted thud. The moment he did, the entire room seemed to exhale, a ripple of energy passing through the air. The runes along the walls began to glow brighter, the symbols on the pedestals lighting up, as though the room itself was reacting to the ritual about to unfold. Mintina stepped up beside him, her hands moving to her waist to pull out a small, ceremonial blade. It was thin, almost delicate in appearance, but the edge gleamed with a deadly sharpness that made David's stomach tighten. "This is the rite of binding," Mintina explained, her voice low and steady. "You'll spill blood, and so will we. Our fates will intertwine, as will our power." David swallowed, trying to steady his nerves. He had expected danger, but this was something else entirely. Mintina met his gaze, her eyes softening for a brief moment. "Don't worry, it's not as painful as it seems, at least not for you." David didn't know whether that was meant to comfort him or not, but before he could respond, Mintina raised the blade. Without hesitation, she sliced a shallow cut across the palm of her own hand, a small trickle of green blood pooling in her palm. David's eyes widened. He hadn't expected it to be that quick, that simple. "Now you," Sial said, stepping forward and placing her hand on his shoulder. Her touch was cool, reassuring, even though her voice was all business. "This is the moment. You're bound to us and to the throne." David nodded, his mind still trying to process everything. His hand shook as he took the blade from Mintina, the weight of the ritual pressing down on him. This wasn't just about him anymore. This wasn't just about surviving. It was about something far bigger than he could have ever imagined. He held his palm out, and as Mintina and Sial guided his hand, he pressed the blade into his skin. The pain was sharp but not unbearable. The blood that welled up was dark, nearly black under the strange light of the temple, his blood mingling with theirs. It was only then, as the ritual completed and the power of Zios surged through him, that David truly understood the significance of what had just happened. The world felt different, alive, pulsing beneath his feet. The core, the heart of the planet, had acknowledged him. The ritual wasn't just about making him a part of Clan Vector. It had made him a part of Zios itself. Sial stepped back, watching him closely as the blood between them began to glow with a faint green light. "You're ours now, David, but you're also something more. You're bonded to the throne, to Zios, and whether you like it or not, this war is yours to fight." David's head was spinning, his body still adjusting to the energy coursing through him. He felt tethered to the planet, to the core, in ways he couldn't explain. His life was no longer his own. He had been irrevocably changed. Mintina's voice broke through his thoughts. "You understand now, don't you? This isn't just about revenge, it's about the future of our world." David met her eyes, the weight of her words settling like a stone in his chest. He didn't have to like it, he didn't have to understand it. But he knew one thing for certain: there was no turning back now. He was bound to Zios, bound to them. And now the real fight had begun. As the ritual ended, a loud crash echoed through the temple. The ground trembled beneath their feet and David's heart skipped. Sial's eyes shot wide open. "It's them, Corbin's forces, they've found us." Mintina drew her sidearm, her gaze hardening. "Get ready, David, it's time to fight." But as the walls of the temple began to crack, David's thoughts were only on one thing: the core. It was calling to him, something was happening, and he didn't know if he could stop it. The walls of the temple shook violently, dust falling from the ceiling as the rumbling intensified. David's heart pounded in his chest as the cold air from outside poured into the room, carrying with it the unmistakable sound of distant engines, the low thrum of military vehicles closing in. Corbin's forces were here. "This is bad," Sial muttered, her voice tight with urgency. She scanned the room, her mind working quickly as she assessed their options. "We need to move now." Mintina was already at the doorway, her rifle drawn, her stance poised for action. "We don't have much time. David, stick close to us. Sial, where are the emergency exits?" Sial's eyes flicked to the far corner of the temple, where a hidden door had been covered by a thick layer of ice and snow. "Through there. It leads to a series of tunnels below the mountain. We'll be able to make it to the rendezvous point, but it's going to be a fight getting there." David's breath quickened, a mix of anxiety and adrenaline beginning to pump through him. He had only just learned about the war on Zios, and now, in the span of hours, he was thrust into the thick of it. The blood ritual had bound him to them, yes, but it had also bound him to this war, to the stakes, to the planet itself. There was no going back. "Let's move, then," David said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. His fingers tightened around the rifle Mintina had handed him, his body still adjusting to the overwhelming power of the ritual. The connection to Zios was like an electric hum in his veins, and even now he could feel the core beneath the surface of the planet, resonating in time with his heartbeat. "We're not just fighting for the throne anymore," Mintina said as she led them through the narrow corridor toward the exit, her tone hard. "We're fighting for the survival of Zios. Corbin's forces aren't just mercenaries, they're hunting us down to the last. If we don't stop him, this world dies." David swallowed, the gravity of her words hitting him like a punch to the gut. He had no illusions about the consequences anymore. This wasn't just about him. This was about survival, about saving a world he barely understood, and a people who had taken him in when he had nowhere else to turn. The door at the end of the corridor creaked open, revealing the hidden passage behind it. The cold air rushed in, biting at their exposed skin as they moved swiftly into the tunnel. Sial took the lead, her eyes constantly scanning their surroundings, while Mintina fell in step beside David, her expression focused, but something flickered in her eyes, a flash of something almost soft. David noticed but said nothing. There were more pressing concerns now. "Once we get underground, we'll have some cover," Sial explained, her voice low but clear in the tense silence. "But we need to move fast. The longer we stay here, the more time Corbin has to find us, and once he does, there's no escaping him." As they moved deeper into the tunnels, the air grew even colder, the darkness swallowing them whole. The walls were rough-hewn, jagged with age, but there was a faint glow coming from the runes embedded deep within the stone. The same pulse David had felt earlier, the connection to the core, seemed to resonate through the walls, as if the planet itself was reaching out to him, urging him to keep moving. "What's this place?" David asked, his voice echoing faintly off the stone. Sial glanced over her shoulder, her face grim. "This is one of the oldest networks on Zios, built by the original rulers of the planet. It's how Clan Vector has always escaped danger when things got too hot. But it's old, dangerous. We'll need to move carefully. David nodded, his eyes adjusting to the low light. He could barely make out the narrow passageways ahead of them, the distant sound of rumbling still echoing through the stone, growing louder by the minute. He had no illusions anymore about what was at stake. Corbin was no ordinary enemy, and they didn't have much time to get ahead of him. They rounded a sharp corner, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the thick stone, and emerged into a wider cavern. A few scattered lights flickered on the walls, casting long shadows across the jagged ground. In the center of the cavern stood a large platform, its surface worn and cracked. It looked like it had been used for something important, rituals, perhaps, but David wasn't sure what. "This is where we part ways," Sial said, halting abruptly. She turned to face David, her eyes hard and calculating. "I'm going ahead to set up the defensive perimeter. We need to make sure Corbin doesn't know we've entered the mountain." Mintina stepped forward, her hand resting briefly on David's shoulder. "Stay safe, Sial," she said quietly, her voice holding a rare note of softness. David watched as Sial disappeared into the shadows, her figure swallowed by the darkness. He turned to Mintina, feeling the weight of her gaze on him, as though she were sizing him up for something more. "What now?" he asked, his voice low. Mintina's lips curved into a smile, but it was tight, strained. "Now, we make sure Corbin doesn't get his hands on the core. We don't just need to beat him. We need to stop him from destroying everything." David nodded, his mind racing. It felt like every step he took, every choice he made, brought him deeper into something he couldn't quite control. The war, the throne, the core, they were all tangled together, and he was in the center of it. As the sounds of distant engines grew louder, the low rumble shaking the earth beneath them, David's heart skipped. He could feel it, the pull of the core beneath his feet. He could almost hear it, whispering to him, urging him to act, to make the right choices. But the right choice was unclear. Corbin's forces were coming, and they were getting closer with every passing second. Suddenly, a crackling sound filled the air, followed by a harsh voice that made David's blood run cold. "This is Commander Thorin of Corbin's forces," the voice boomed through the air, amplified through hidden speakers. "We know you're here. Surrender, or we will make you wish you hadn't." Mintina's hand tightened around the grip of her weapon, her jaw set. "He's faster than we thought," she muttered. David's pulse quickened. They were trapped. "We don't have much time," Mintina said, turning to him. Her voice was low, but there was a steely edge to it. "They're closing in, and when they do, it's over for us, for Zios." David glanced down at the glowing stone beneath his feet. The core was still pulling at him, still resonating with his blood. It was as if the planet itself was aware of the imminent danger, aware of the fight that was about to unfold. "We fight then," he said, his voice steady despite the rising fear inside him. "We do what we can." Mintina met his gaze, a flash of something fierce in her eyes. "That's what I like to hear." As the sound of enemy forces grew louder, David couldn't help but feel the weight of everything that had happened. He wasn't just a diplomat anymore. He was bound to Zios, bound to this fight, bound to the war that would either save this planet or destroy it. Just as David and Mintina prepared to move out, the walls of the cavern began to shake again. The distant rumble had turned into a deafening roar. David's heart sank as a massive shape appeared in the shadows, looming at the entrance of the cavern. A war machine, towering and hulking, its guns aimed straight at them. And in that moment, David knew the fight had just begun. The war machine loomed at the cavern's entrance, its massive frame blocking the only exit. Its cannons were mounted on either side, glowing with the ominous hum of charged energy. The deafening sound of its engines reverberated through the stone walls, the ground beneath David's feet trembling with each passing second. "This is it," David muttered under his breath. His fingers tightened around the rifle Mintina had given him, but his legs felt unsteady as though the weight of everything, this war, the planet, the power surging through him, was finally starting to crush him. Mintina, however, was already in motion, her eyes narrowed with focus. "Get down!" she shouted as she dropped into a crouch, raising her weapon and firing without hesitation. The sound of her shots echoed through the cavern, the energy blasts sizzling through the air toward the war machine. But the shots bounced off the thick, reinforced armor of the machine without so much as a dent. It was clear that their weapons wouldn't be enough to stop it. David followed her lead, taking cover behind a jagged rock formation. His mind raced. They had no chance of taking down the war machine with their current weapons. They needed a plan, a better plan. "Mintina, we can't win this fight head-on," David shouted over the noise of the machine's engines. "We need to find a way around it." "I know," Mintina snapped, glancing at him. "We're not winning this fight with brute force. Get ready to move." But before they could execute any kind of plan, a sudden explosion from above rocked the cavern. Debris fell from the ceiling, showering them with rocks and dust, forcing David and Mintina to duck for cover. The rumble of the blast subsided, leaving behind a ringing silence. Then, through the haze, a new figure appeared from the shadows, an unfamiliar soldier wearing the insignia of Corbin's forces. David's heart dropped. No. The figure moved swiftly, his movements calculated, a clear sign of someone trained for stealth. He was a lean, dangerous-looking man, his sharp features hidden beneath a helmet, but David knew him immediately. It wasn't just the uniform. It wasn't just the emblem. It was the way he moved, the way he looked at him with eyes filled with cold recognition. "Malik," David whispered, his voice cracking. Mintina's head snapped to the newcomer. She tensed, her fingers twitching on the trigger, but David put his hand out to stop her. "David," Malik said, his voice low and controlled, a smile creeping across his face as he slowly pulled off his helmet. His black hair, dark as a starless night, framed his sharp jawline. But what made David's stomach twist was the scar cutting through Malik's lip, something that hadn't been there before. "You're alive," David said, the words bitter in his mouth. "Alive, I should be asking you the same thing," Malik replied, his smile widening as he took slow, measured steps forward. "Did you really think you could just walk away from the mess you started, that you'd be safe?" David's mind spun, trying to understand how Malik was involved with Corbin's forces. His thoughts flickered back to their shared past, before everything had gone to hell, before Zios, before the Federation. They fought side by side back in the trenches of the war on Omega Station. But this man, this soldier in front of him, wasn't the same one he had once trusted. David shook his head, trying to keep his emotions in check. "You're with them now, with Corbin." Malik's eyes darkened. "I'm not with Corbin, I'm with the highest bidder." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small device, tossing it onto the ground. A holographic display flickered to life, showing a map of the surrounding area. "The situation's simple, David," Malik said. "I'm here to offer you a choice. You can fight for this planet and die with the rest of them, or you can join me. I'll make sure you walk away from this alive. No war, no more fighting, just survival." David's pulse quickened. Betrayal, confusion, and anger swirled within him. He had known Malik. They had been brothers in arms. The thought that he could turn on him like this made David sick. "You think I'm just going to walk away?" he asked, voice tight with disbelief. "After everything that's happened, after what's been done to this planet?" Malik's smile was cold. "You always did think you had the moral high ground, but here's the reality. You're on a dying world. There's no saving Zios. Corbin will win this war, and you know it. The only way you get out alive is by making the right choice." David's hands clenched into fists, his teeth grinding as he faced the man he had once called a friend. "And if I refuse?" "If you refuse," Malik said, his tone darkening, "then we're enemies, and you'll die with them." Mintina, who had been watching the exchange with a mixture of confusion and caution, stepped forward, her weapon trained on Malik. "He's not going anywhere with you," she said, her voice icy. Malik didn't even flinch. "You really think that'll stop me?" The air seemed to crackle with tension as both sides faced off. David's mind raced. He didn't know what had happened to Malik. He didn't understand why he had turned. But the stakes were too high for sentiment now. They couldn't afford to hesitate. "You were always the one who tried to play it safe," Malik taunted, his voice dripping with disdain. "But now, you have a choice. Fight with me and you can live. Otherwise, you'll be nothing more than another casualty in this war." David swallowed, his pulse pounding in his ears. He glanced at Mintina, who was still holding her ground, and then back at Malik. He had once believed in everything Malik stood for in their shared mission. But now, David was beginning to understand just how far Malik had fallen. "David, don't listen to him," Mintina said, her voice a soft, urgent plea. "We don't need him. You've already made your choice." David's eyes flicked from Malik to Mintina, her unwavering resolve giving him the strength to act. There was no question in his mind now. He knew what he had to do. "I don't need your offer," David said, his voice firm. "I don't need you, Malik. I'm not running. I'm not going to turn my back on these people." Malik's eyes narrowed, his smile fading. "Then you'll die with them," he said, his voice dark and menacing. The ground suddenly trembled again. The war machine outside had moved closer, its cannons charging. David knew they didn't have much time. "You've made your choice," Malik said, raising his weapon. But before he could fire, a loud explosion shook the cavern, throwing them all to the ground. The war machine's fire had hit its target. The ground cracked open beneath David's feet, sending a blast of rock and debris scattering through the air. David's world went black. David's body crashed into the hard stone floor, his vision blurring as his consciousness flickered. He could hear shouting, gunfire, and the deafening roar of the war machine. But the one thing that stood out, the thing that terrified him the most, was the faint, eerie hum he could feel deep in his chest. The core was reacting. And David was beginning to realize the true price of the power that had bound him to Zios. David awoke to the familiar sting of cold stone against his skin, his body bruised and aching from the blast. His vision swam as he tried to focus, the world around him still spinning from the chaos. The war machine's explosion had thrown him back, and the air was thick with smoke, dust, and the acrid scent of burning metal. His head throbbed, but he could still hear the faint hum of the geothermal core beneath the planet's surface, pulsing like a heartbeat, reminding him that he was bound to this place, bound to this war. He gasped, his breath shallow, as he struggled to sit up. The world around him was a blur of shapes and shadows. Somewhere nearby, Mintina was shouting, her voice piercing the haze, but the sound was muffled, distant. He forced himself to focus, pushing through the dizziness. As the world around him began to clear, his eyes landed on her, Mintina. She was crouched behind a large rock formation, her weapon raised, scanning for any signs of enemy movement. The fierce determination in her expression reminded him of everything that had happened, the war, the bonds, the choices he had made. And then the reality of what he had just witnessed. Malik. "David," Mintina's voice broke through the fog of his thoughts, her gaze locking onto him as she rushed over to his side. She knelt beside him, her hands steadying him as he struggled to sit up. "You're alive. Damn it, stay with me." David shook his head, trying to clear the last remnants of dizziness. "I'm fine, just need a minute," he said, his voice weak but resolute. His hand instinctively went to his side, where the pain was sharp and raw. The explosion had rattled him, but it was nothing compared to the crushing weight of what had happened. Malik, he couldn't shake the image of his old friend, his brother, standing there offering him a choice. Betrayal tasted bitter on his tongue, and worse yet, there had been no time to deal with it. They had to keep moving. The fight wasn't over. It wouldn't be until they took the war machine down and until they dealt with Corbin once and for all. "We need to move," Mintina said, her voice hardening as she helped him to his feet. "The explosion won't slow them down for long. They'll regroup. We don't have much time before they bring the rest of the assault team." David gritted his teeth. Every part of him wanted to retreat, to hide, to run from the mess that had become his life since landing on Zios. But there was no running now. Not from Malik, not from Corbin, not from what he had become. His life had been tied to this war, to the planet, to the people who had saved him, and who now depended on him. "Right, no more hesitation," David muttered to himself, finding his balance again as he leaned into Mintina for support. He could feel the weight of the blood debt binding him to her, to Sial, to Zios, and to the throne they were fighting for. A piece of him, buried deep within, knew it was too late to turn back. He had chosen his path, and it would either lead him to victory or to his death. Mintina led the way, her eyes darting between the shadows, scanning for any signs of danger. The cavern they had taken refuge in was narrow, its jagged edges making it difficult to move swiftly, but they had no choice but to press on. As they moved deeper into the mountain, David couldn't help but feel the pull of the core beneath him again, its hum vibrating in the bones of his chest. The connection was growing stronger, harder to ignore. It was like the planet itself was alive, aware of him, of them. He had never believed in such things before, but Zios was different. This world was something ancient, something powerful, and it was tied to him now. They rounded a corner and came face to face with the entrance to an old chamber, one that had been sealed long ago, perhaps even forgotten by the people of Zios. The door, a massive stone slab adorned with faded symbols of the royal family, stood partially open, revealing the darkness beyond. "This is it," Mintina said, pausing just before the threshold. She glanced over at David, her eyes steely. "We've got one shot at this. Once we go in, there's no turning back." David nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. "Let's do it." With that, Mintina stepped forward, pushing the door open just enough for them to slip through. The chamber beyond was vast, its walls lined with stone pillars covered in ancient runes, some glowing faintly with a strange, ethereal light. At the far end of the room stood a massive control console, the centerpiece of the chamber. It was surrounded by wires and cables that had long since gone dormant, but the faint hum of the geothermal core resonated through the room, sending chills down David's spine. "This is it," Sial's voice came from the shadows, and David turned to see her emerge, her face a mask of calm determination. "The heart of Zios, the control center for the core." David could feel the weight of her words. This was where everything came together, the planet's life force, the throne, the war. If they were going to succeed, they needed to take control of the core before Corbin could destroy it, or worse, use it to control the entire planet. Mintina moved toward the console, her fingers dancing across the buttons and levers with practiced ease. "We need to unlock the core's access points," she said, her voice steady, but there was an edge to it now. "If Corbin gets his hands on this, Zios is finished." David stepped forward, his breath quickening as he stared at the glowing screen. The blueprints of the geothermal core appeared in front of them, an intricate network of channels, conduits, and energy nodes that fed power throughout the entire planet. But something was wrong. David's eyes widened. There in the lower left corner of the screen was a symbol he didn't recognize. It flickered and pulsed, an ominous red glow beneath the surface. "What the hell is that?" he muttered, pointing to the symbol. Mintina's face went pale as she leaned over to look. "It's a backdoor access point. Corbin must have installed it after the coup. It's a failsafe. If triggered, it will shut down the core completely. He can lock us out for good." Sial stepped forward, her expression darkening. "He's trying to break the core's connection to the planet. If he succeeds, Zios will begin to deteriorate in ways we can't predict. The core's failure could trigger a planetary collapse." David felt his stomach drop. The core was the planet's lifeblood. If it went down, Zios would die with it. "They're already inside," Mintina said, her voice tight with fear. "We need to stop this." The floor shook again, more violently this time. The war machine outside was closing in, and David knew that time was running out. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the screen in front of them went black. David's heart sank as a chilling voice filled the room, amplified through hidden speakers. "You should have stayed out of this, David," Corbin's voice sneered. "You've made a mistake. Now you're all going to watch as I bring this world to its knees." The screen blinked back to life, showing a map of the core's power grid, but the symbol was gone. Instead, a new message appeared. "The core is mine, you can't stop me." And just then, the walls of the chamber began to rumble again, louder than ever before. The countdown had begun. The rumble beneath their feet intensified, a tremor that shook the very walls of the chamber. The countdown had begun, and David could feel the weight of it pressing down on him, suffocating him with the knowledge that Zios, the planet that had become his reluctant home, was on the brink of destruction. If Corbin had control of the core, then there was nothing left to stop him. The planet would die, and with it, any hope of peace. "No," Mintina said, her voice hard with determination as she slammed her palm onto the console. "We're not letting him win, not this time." David's mind raced as he processed the urgency of the situation. The room around him felt smaller now, the air thick with the tension of knowing they had only minutes to stop Corbin. Their only chance was to access the core and prevent Corbin from triggering the failsafe. But that symbol, the backdoor access point, meant that Corbin had locked them out of the core completely. "We have to override it," Sial said, her voice calm, but David could see the flicker of anxiety in her eyes. "If we don't, we'll lose Zios," Mintina finished for her, her fingers flying across the console's interface, trying to bypass Corbin's security measures. "We need to do this now. The fail-safe is linked to his command center. We cut the link and we can regain control." The sound of heavy boots outside the chamber door echoed through the stone hall. Corbin's forces were closing in. The war machine's engines still roared outside, its shadow looming like a harbinger of doom. David's heart pounded in his chest. He knew they were running out of time. "There's no time for hesitation," he thought, remembering Mintina's earlier words. "We do what we can." Mintina didn't look up from the console, her face set in a mask of focus. "Sial, you keep an eye on the door. David, help me with the override." David nodded, his pulse spiking. He moved to her side, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for the console's secondary interface. They had to act fast. The planet's future was in their hands. "What exactly are we doing?" David asked, trying to keep the panic from creeping into his voice. "You said we need to cut the link. How?" Mintina's eyes never left the screen. "The core is controlled by a network of energy channels. They're all linked together in a sequence. If we sever the link between Corbin's failsafe and the core's primary power grid, we'll restore control. But it won't be easy. Corbin's embedded his failsafe deep into the system." David's heart raced. The weight of the task before them was immense, and he knew that even if they succeeded, there was no guarantee they'd make it out alive. The war machine outside wasn't the only threat they faced. Corbin had everything at his disposal, and if he couldn't stop them through force, he'd try to make them second-guess their choices. "Corbin won't give up that easily," Sial said, as if reading David's thoughts. She stood at the door, her rifle aimed down the darkened corridor. "We have to be ready." Mintina nodded in agreement. "No matter what happens, we can't let him lock us out of the core." David's fingers hovered over the interface, uncertainty gnawing at him. His mind was still reeling from the earlier confrontation with Malik, the sting of betrayal fresh in his mind. He had trusted Malik once, fought beside him in battles, shared a bond that had felt unbreakable. But now Malik had chosen his side, and it wasn't theirs. "Mintina, David started, but his words faltered as a low, guttural sound echoed through the walls. A sound David knew all too well. "Not now," Mintina snapped, her voice sharp. "Focus." David's hands moved quickly, pressing buttons in a desperate attempt to override Corbin's control. His fingers flew over the console's keys, the symbols blurring in front of him as he tried to trace the link Corbin had used to lock them out. Sweat beaded on his forehead as the countdown continued. The air felt suffocating, the hum of the core growing louder in his chest, almost as if it were aware of the battle for its life. Then, as he punched in a sequence of commands, the console blinked red. "Damn it," Mintina hissed. "We're running out of time. We have to break through the encryption." David's mind raced. "I can do this." He focused harder, trying to remember every bit of training he'd ever received, every moment he'd spent on missions, every negotiation, every battle. It wasn't just about technology. It was about human ingenuity, about adaptation. And maybe, just maybe, his ability to think outside the box could give them the edge they needed. The console flickered again, and David's hand slammed onto a final key. For a moment, the room was silent. Then, with a blinding flash of light, the interface came alive. "Got it," David shouted, his voice hoarse with relief. "I've broken the link." Mintina's eyes widened. "We're in." But before they could celebrate, a deafening crash shook the chamber. The door to the control room flew open with a violent force, sending fragments of stone and debris flying through the air. David barely had time to react. The war machine outside had found them. "Get ready," Sial shouted, her rifle raised as she fired into the opening. The blast of energy struck the first soldier that had entered, sending him sprawling to the ground. But there were more. More soldiers rushed into the chamber, their weapons drawn, their faces hidden behind masks. The battle had come to them, and there was no escaping it now. Mintina shoved David behind the console as another blast rang out. "Stay down." David's heart was in his throat. The battle was here. Corbin had brought everything with him, and David could feel the weight of it all, the war, the planet, the future, bearing down on them. But they couldn't stop, not now. "Mintina, we're in control," David yelled over the chaos, his pulse thundering in his ears. "We need to secure the core if we can hold it." "If we can hold it, Zio's lives," Mintina finished, her voice filled with urgency. She turned to Sial. "Keep them off us, we'll finish this." Sial nodded without hesitation, taking her position by the door and firing back into the oncoming enemy forces. The sounds of battle filled the air, shots, screams, the crackling of energy blasts. David's fingers flew over the console again, now working in tandem with Mintina as they tried to restore the core's power. It was fragile, the connection tenuous at best. They had no room for error. Time seemed to stretch, the seconds ticking by like hours. Sweat dripped from David's brow as he worked, the pressure mounting with every passing moment. His fingers bled as they pressed against the buttons, but he didn't stop. There was too much at stake. Then a sudden, blinding flash lit the room. The core pulsed with an overwhelming surge of power, the energy crackling through the walls as the entire structure seemed to come alive. "We did it," Mintina shouted, her eyes wide with relief. But their victory was short-lived. As the core stabilized, a final, unexpected figure entered the room, Malik, standing in the doorway, his weapon raised. His eyes locked onto David's with cold, unflinching resolve. "Not so fast, little brother," Malik said, his voice a low, bitter growl. "You think you can save this planet? It's already too late." David's blood ran cold. The war was far from over, and now the real battle was just beginning. Malik raised his weapon, and David knew that the final choice was upon him. Was this the end, or was there still hope for Zios? Would the core's power be enough to stop Corbin, or would the betrayal of a brother tear it all apart? And more importantly, would David survive to see it through?